Hi everyone, I'm here with Randall Carlson. He's a master builder and architectural designer, geological explorer, and an independent scholar. Welcome, Randall.
Well, thank you for having me, Suma.
I so appreciate you accepting my invite. I know how busy you are with your research.
Not too busy for this.
Thank you. I know you have been deeply involved with sacred geometry, and there is very less knowledge about this subject online. And if you could give us a background about what sacred geometry is.
Yes. One of the things that seems to unite many cultures around the world and across history is the belief in the value and importance of geometry and the utilization of geometry through multiple venues. Principally, the one that initially drew me into it was the applications of geometry to architecture, but also to art, to various crafts, to music. Anything that is created can utilize sacred geometry. Now, to me, what makes sacred geometry sacred is the fact that it's not really an invention, it's a discovery about fundamental patterns and proportions that are found throughout the natural order, independent of humans, right? So you can look to nature and you see that there are geometric patterns that unite things from the, say, the level of molecular geometry all the way up to the astronomical level. And by some means, ancient peoples were in tune with this idea of geometric proportion and attempted to incorporate that knowledge into anything that they created or built, with the idea in mind that if you could incorporate the appropriate proportions, you would end up with harmony. And that was the whole basis, was to create a system of harmony that could synthesize the human level with the natural phenomena. And so temples were built and they utilized geometry. They also incorporated orientation. So a temple was not sited randomly. It was always oriented towards some auspicious moment in time, which was astronomical. And that moment in time could be one of the solstices, one of the equinoxes. It could be the position of the moon during an auspicious part of its cycle, because the moon, for example, goes through an 18.6-year cycle. And the rising and setting of the moon was very important. Also, where on the land the structure was located. This is kind of what has given rise to an area of practice called geomancy, which is mapping the energy patterns in the landscape. And so there was a whole system of building sacred structures that utilized geometry, orientation, symbolism, the geomantic mapping of the energy in a site. So one of the things that you find universally with many of these ancient structures, for example, is their association with water. A prime example, Chartres Cathedral, which we'll talk about in a little while. Chartres Cathedral was built on a mound, and below that mound was a sacred well. And several fault lines came together there, and the water flowed through those fault lines, and the sacred well went down into the water table. And long before Chartres Cathedral had been built, this mound was a site of sacred pilgrimage, because it was believed that it had special properties. And if we want to try to analyze it scientifically, it would appear that if there were special properties, it was related to the fact that it was sited with respect to the underground water and underground geology. So you had these multiple factors coming together that led to the system of sacred architecture. Key to that was the geometry. And the geometric principles that they would use when we do a drawing course in sacred geometry, we only use two tools. A compass like this, with which we draw circles, and a simple straight edge. On the building site, they would have chord stretchers. So you would start with a center, which would be the sacred center, the navel or omphalos, in the Greek term, and that would be the sacred center from which the temple emerged. And the way that they would visualize the temple was that it was almost like an organic process. So once they found the sacred center, you would establish a vertical pole there, which could be, sometimes it was called a gnomon pole. It could be pretty much anything from a stick in the ground to a large stone structure like an obelisk, for example. From that center, you could pull out a cord, and you could draw arcs and circles. And you could also, with that cord, it would serve as a line. And generally what you do is establish the sacred center, and then the cord stretcher would draw a line that aligned with that point on the horizon that they were looking for, so that you had the geometric pattern, but the geometric pattern wasn't arbitrarily oriented on the landscape. The geometric pattern was oriented toward this auspicious moment, which, like I said, could be the rising or setting of the sun. It could be the rising or setting of the moon, or it could be the rising and setting of a particular star or group of stars, like the Pleiades was oftentimes used as a marker to begin the annual cycle. Oftentimes calendars, ancient calendars were calibrated by means of alignment with the Pleiades. So in the Pythagorean lodges and in the Pythagorean or Platonic Academy in ancient Greece, this is what they would do. They would start with a simple exercise of drawing a line and then drawing circles upon that line, and each step within the geometric process would yield points that could be used to then generate the next level of the geometric diagram. So I got into it primarily because of building, and back in 1972 I was part of a spiritual group, and we were studying meditation and yoga and various things like that. And we had several retreats. We bought land in northern Minnesota, and there was, at that time, very popular was geodesic domes, which were based on the geometry devised or invented by Buckminster Fuller. And we built 2 geodesic domes, and one of them was built to have a spire on the top, which represented the spire that came to a point represented the Bindu, which is like the ultimate singularity from which everything in the universe emerged. And because of the fact that I had had some carpentry and building experience, because my father was a builder, I got recruited to be in charge of building one of the domes. So I had to study up and learn about geodesic geometry. So I went, learned from Buckminster Fuller and learned about this geometry in order to build this structure, at least be the lead carpenter on it. Well, then shortly thereafter, one of the 2 domes that we built was featured in a national publication called Shelter. And in that, what it did was it went into a lot of detail on vernacular architecture, indigenous architecture, traditional architectural styles around the world. Because of the fact that the domes that I worked on was featured in there, I bought the book, and in there was a lot of very interesting stuff about how geometry was used. And this was my first exposure to the idea of geometry as something other than just a simple practical methodology, that there was actually a symbolism behind it, and a kind of the idea that virtue could be inculcated through applications of the proper geometry and so on. So one of the things that was in there was it discussed Islamic geometry. It also discussed geometry of life, and this was my first introduction to the so-called golden section or divine proportion. So this was 1972. In 1972, there wasn't much available on the subject. I got really into it, began to go into what there was available. One of the things that was available was a 2-volume set called Sacred Geometry by George Lesser. And it was written, I believe it was published in the late 1940s or early 1950s. And it was a 2-volume set. It was about primarily how geometry was used to construct cathedrals. As far as I can tell, this was the earliest use I have seen of the term sacred geometry, was in this gentleman's books. They were not available anywhere. They were totally out of print. And then just as these things happen, I happened to go to a library sale, and lo and behold, there was the 2-volume set for sale, like for $2 or something, which if you were going to get that nowadays, I'm sure it would probably be hundreds of dollars. So I just lucked into this 2-volume set of George Lesser's books. And it has, nice fold-out plates with diagrams and everything. So I got those, of course, picked it up and then began to study that. And then I discovered the work of John Michel, the late John Michel, who was a interesting fellow who wrote a lot of interesting books synthesizing all of this stuff that we're talking about, the geometry, the geomancy, the astronomy, the symbolism. He wrote a book called The View Over Atlantis, which was published 1969, I believe. I think I actually picked up a copy of it in about 73 or whatever. That was followed up by a book that he wrote called City of Revelation. In the City of Revelation, one of the things that he really got into was also showing that there was a geometry or an architecture of language. And the key to that was the fact that many of the ancient Semitic languages were not only alphabetic, but they were numeric. So that the Greek language, as an example, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, etc., were not only letters of the alphabet, but they were also numbers. Alpha was 1, beta was 2, gamma was 3, delta was 4, etc. Likewise with the Hebrew alphabet. So you had Aleph, Bet, Gimel, Dalet, He, Va, Zen, Het, Tet, Yud, and you went 1 through 10. And then you went 10, 20, 30, 40, up to 100, and then you went by hundreds, 100, 200, 400. So what this meant was that if you took certain keywords and phrases, you could substitute in numbers for letters, right? What John Michel showed was that in case after case after case, when you did that, these key names and phrases and words in the Hebrew Old Testament, in the Greek New Testament, in other apocryphal works, and numerous other works, written in Greek, for example, the New Testament was written in Greek, that you could go in there and you could substitute the numbers for the names and the words and the phrases. And then it turned out that those numbers had geometric significance. They would all often show geometric relationships and so on. And so that to me was extremely fascinating. And he showed case after case after case. So then that led me to a man by the name of Keith Critchlow, who was an architect in England, who was at the time probably considered the foremost expert on sacred geometry. This would have been late 1970s into the 1980s. So I began to procure his work, where he really began to analyze the geometry and orientation of sacred structures and how it was utilized in architecture and so on. He also was an expert on Islamic geometry and design. So I had the opportunity to take a week-long workshop with him in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains in 1988 at the Lindisfarne Center. And that was a big milestone in my studies of sacred geometry, because he put me onto a lot of things and sources of information and so on that was probably not generally available at the time. So I just continued my studies and began about mid-1980s doing classes. People were interested, they asked me about it, so then one time I got invited to do a lecture at a small center. This was in the early 1980s, and I presented a lecture. Back then I just used an old-fashioned slide projector, and people enjoyed it, so I kept doing it. And then I made trips to Europe, to Egypt, to Central America to see firsthand and document firsthand some of the structures that they were that they had built in these places. And again, what I found was that there was sort of a common system used throughout the ancient world that employed all of these things I was just talking about, including a common system of measurement or metrology. So that's kind of how I got into it. I'm sure I've left many things out, but that's kind of generally, you know, I loved geometry as a kid, so I definitely go back that far, you know, and enjoyed geometry immensely, and then kind of forgot about it until I, you know, rediscovered it in the 70s. So that's pretty much a synopsis.
What are some of the practical applications of this knowledge?
Well, the practical applications of it are just endless. You know, for me, it was mostly in building. I took, after I moved to Atlanta in the mid-70s, I took several courses in engineering because that's when I was starting my business. One of the courses that I took was in engineering, graphics, and design. So there, you know, it's all about geometric drawing used for any kind of purpose. You know, if you're going to, for industrial purposes, if you're going to create a new machine, there's all kinds of drawings that have to be done. And those would utilize geometry. So I think where I really started drawing, using, you know, these tools, was in that course, which I think was 75 or 76, right in there. So I had, you know, I discovered the system, you know, like I said, in 1972, but I never actually did anything with it, like actually picking up the tools and doing the drawings until I did this course. And then from there, I discovered that I was constantly using it when I would get hired for building projects. And I discovered that by knowing some geometry, it gave me sort of a competitive edge to those guys who are out there who didn't know how to use geometry. But for me, when we're going to build a new project, it all starts just like back, you know, thousands of years ago. We stake out one particular corner of the project, and usually it's the northeast corner because that has symbolic connotations. Like in Freemasonry, all the Masonic temples are always, the cornerstone is laid in the northeast corner. And then the temple or the structure is built from there. It emerges from that northeast corner, the cornerstone, right? The cornerstone is laid ceremoniously. It's inscribed with symbols and all of this. Sometimes there might be a time capsule incorporated. But the symbolism here is that in the northern hemisphere, the northeast corner of any building will be the darkest corner. So you establish the cornerstone in the dark corner, and then as the temple is built, as it emerges, it's growing from the darkness towards the light, you see. So I like that. So usually what we'll do is, you know, if we're starting a new project, we'll lay it out, or if I'm designing a project, I'll usually start it from the northeast corner. And then from there, you know, of course I'm doing it all in computer now, so I'm not using these, but in any computer, you know, drawing or graphics program, you can easily draw circles and lines, and any geometric figure you want. So I will lay out the design from that point, you see. And that's where all geometric processes start, is from a single point. And again, the idea there is you're kind of recapitulating the whole creative process, you know, in the cosmological ideas of how the universe came to be. You had this singularity, the ultimate singularity. And then you had the Big Bang, and out of that came all of creation, see. And like I mentioned earlier, in the Hindu concept, it was the Bindu point. Mm-hmm. That was the same idea, that you had this ultimate singularity that contained all potential. And that from that singularity, all of creation, all of the universe emerged. In geometry, that singularity is that point right there. See, when you start the geometric drawing, you put that point, and from there, the whole process begins. You see, and everything rotates around that point. It's like the central point that orients all of everything. I have a slide that shows the North Polar Star and how everything rotates around the North Polar Star, and which to me is a great representation of that concept as far as how we would see it in the natural world. So now, another practical application of it is the artists, use of it by artists, because we can show some examples here as we get on how geometry would be used as a proportioning grid or template, and it was used by many artists. In fact, there's a book called Artist's Secret Geometry. It was one of the principles or methods that were utilized by artists to create a template over which they would do their painting. And when we go through the sequence of dynamic symmetry shortly, you can see how in any composition there will be certain points where most of the composition is static, but there will be certain key points that are dynamic, because from those points you can generate additional layers or additional generations of the pattern. And the idea is you're looking for harmony. And the idea of harmony is that you're looking for a relationship between, in any composition, the relationship between the part and the whole. You want to have a resonance between that. And here, like here, this image shows, you know, the ultimate geometry around how which our world works. You see, everything is rotating in circles. See, there are no straight lines in nature. But in fact, even when we draw the straight line on paper, that's only a facsimile. It's because it appears straight only because our scale of perception, you see. So it's just kind of the idea, you know, in calculus, you know, when you have an arc, okay, if you're looking at it in one scale, it's an arc of a circle. As you zoom in and zoom in and zoom in, eventually you can look at it as a portion of a straight line, right? And it's the same way when you look at the horizon, right? It's because our perspective relative to the size of the planet is so minuscule that we can look at the horizon and it appears flat, but it's not really. It's part of an arc. And within that arc, you know, it is curved, but we are so small, microscopic relative to the size of the Earth, that what we perceive is the illusion of flatness.
There's a lot of symbols. When I research about this topic, I come up with, I see some of these symbols with flower of life, fruit of life. Mm-hmm. Can you explain the meaning of these symbols?
Yeah, well, the flower of life is based upon the symmetry of the hexagon and the sixfold division of a circle. And we can look at some graphics in a minute here. But it's an interesting idea that whenever you have a circle and you draw a circle, you will have the circumference and you will have the radius of the circle. Okay, any circle, it doesn't matter what size, it's just inherent within the nature of geometry that when you draw that circle, you then take that same radius and you step around the circumference. It will go exactly 6 times. Exactly 6 times, right? You can then develop from there a whole set of patterns which are based on the sixfold division of a circle. And you find that very common in crystalline geometry. You find, you know, 6 petals, like lilies, for example, are based on the hexagonal geometry, whereas roses are based on pentagonal geometry. The flower of life is simply a development based on that sixfold geometry. And I think what you could say is that, you know, the sixfold, actually, to me, the more the geometry of life is the fivefold geometry. Sixfold geometry we find more in the realm of matter, inanimate matter, crystals, and so on. Likewise, octagonal geometry. Once we get into the pentagonal geometry, that's where we generally will find, you know, the patterns of life. You know, because for example, the divine section or divine proportion or golden section is based upon pentagonal geometry. And a lot of living things manifest the geometry that we find in the fivefold division of a circle. And we can, of course, in a minute look at how we actually create the flower of life. And it's a very straightforward process, and it all just involves setting out one circle, marking off the circumference, those 6 points, and then using those to generate more circles, all of the same size as the original circle. So we'll have some slides we can look at to show that.
And as a symbol, does it mean anything?
Well, you know, to me, it's such a fundamental way of geometrically organizing things that, to me, it's, you know, intrinsic, an intrinsic part of the structure of the material world, if nothing else. It's also, you know, the geometry of, you know, if you know the chakras, you know, the chakras each have geometric representations. Is it the Anahata chakra that is the sixfold geometry? So there's a flower of life pattern within that. And when we go through the diagrams here, we can see how it is the outcome of this very simple, straightforward geometric process. Like, to get the flower of life, all we need is the sixfold division of a circle, which is very easy to do. To get the pentagonal geometry is more complicated. Okay, so here we have a diagram showing the 7 chakras, and you see the heart chakra is the Anahata chakra. If we zoom in on that Anahata chakra, we should be able to see the geometry of it. Yeah, here we go. You see there's 12 petals, and it's all based on the sixfold division of the circle. And that's what I was saying. If you take the radius of this circle, it'll step off exactly 6 times around. And then by a very simple one more geometric step, you can subdivide that to get 1/12 of the circle. And then that gives us the model of our standard clock on the wall of 12 hours. It also gives us the model of the great year, which is the 12 zodiacal signs representing a full precessional cycle of 25,920 years. And if we go to the so here's a larger version of that with various symbolism. And here's the Manipura chakra, which is based upon a 10-fold division. And like I said, this is the sixfold division is very simple, right? You draw a circle and then you simply walk the compass around it 6 times. This is a little more complicated. It involves additional steps to accomplish the 10-fold division. But nature has utilized this on many levels, and one of the most elegant is how this defines for us the geometry of the DNA molecule. In cross-section, we can see the same 10-fold geometry. This is, like I said, a computer-generated cross-section of the DNA molecule. So that to me is a very beautiful manifestation of the 10-fold, which of course is based first upon the 5-fold division. And we can hopefully look at that with some slides that will be coming up as far as, and so all of the chakras have their geometric correlates, which I think would be beyond our discussion today, but it gives the listener kind of an idea that geometry was so intrinsic to many systems, both spiritual systems and meditation systems, as well as, you know, art and architecture and things like that. Because one of the things, particularly I think, you know, in the Eastern system, it might be the idea of karma yoga. In the Western systems of spirituality, there was a belief that one could attain spiritual liberation through one's work. And if one's work was ritualized and it became symbolical for a larger process of spiritual enlightenment, through one's work of building, of creating something, one could obtain a higher state of consciousness. And I think that is probably true. It bears out, you know, in the field, I think, when you actually have that mindset that you're creating something that is unique and something that resonates with higher principles. Because that's the idea, because you're looking for this resonance, which if things have the proper proportions between them, the proper ratios, then they resonate, right? it's like the idea of if you have two tuning forks and they are in tune with one another, you can vibrate one and the other one on across the room will set up a sympathetic vibration, right? And I think this is the idea, that they're trying to create a structure out of material that is harmonically proportioned to pre-existing patterns of energy in nature, you see. And so, same whether it's a three-dimensional, whether it was a work of architecture, whether it was a work of art, whether it was, you know, a rug that was being woven that would have the proportions in there, or a tile pattern on a mosque. It was the same idea. If you did a tile pattern on a wall on a mosque, the idea was that inherent in that tile pattern was a geometric module that was also found in the whole pattern, the whole complex of the structure as well. The idea again being that the part and the whole are reflections of one another.
So those symmetrical measurements created a sense of resonance.
Yes, yes. And also the idea that, you know, we ourselves are embodiments of geometry. The human anatomy is based on the fivefold geometry and the geometry of the golden section, you know, which is basically tells us that if we have any straight line and we divide that line, we'll create two parts. If we cut it in the middle, each part is the same size, and that is not a dynamic situation. It's a static situation where it's in perfect balance. But if we begin to move that dividing line, the two parts are asymmetrical. They are no longer the same size. But in the golden section, or the divine proportion, we're looking for that one magic point where the ratio of the small section is to the large section exactly as the large section is to the whole line. You see that? So as this is to this is to the whole line. And that is the fundamental proportion of the human anatomy. If you take a person and they're standing vertically, and you take that golden section division, you'll find that if they're standing vertically, the golden section division will define the position of their navel, right? Now, when a human is born, you do not conform to the golden section. A baby, for example, will have their navel in the middle of their body. As you grow into this proportion. Another place it's found very prominently within the human body is the cubit, so elbow to fingertip, right? And where you then would divide that in the golden section gives you your wrist joint. So the cubit, here this would be the cubit, which is the forearm. Cubitus is Latin for forearm, elbow to fingertip. Then there's a space. Anybody watching this can feel on their wrist there will be a space. It's called the space of Destot. And there's a little hole in your wrist that really marks that division. So that this is to this as that is to the whole forearm. And if you take your forearm like this and enlarge it to your full height, that space of Destot there will be your navel. And if you take that proportion and you make a rectangle out of it, that defines the shape of the human face. And it goes, I mean, there are dozens and dozens of manifestations of the golden section in the human anatomy, but found all throughout the natural order. You find it in animals, you find it in plants. And there's a famous sequence that's based upon that. It's called the Fibonacci Sequence. And basically the sequence is that you have every numerical value in that sequence is the sum of the two values that preceded it, right? So it starts 0, 1, 1, 2, 2 plus 1 is 3, 3 plus 2 is 5, 5 plus 3 is 8, 8 plus 5 is 13, 13 plus 8 is 21, and so on, right? As you go through that and your numbers get larger and larger, if you set up a ratio, for example, 21 to 13, or then you add those together and you get 34 to 21, right? What will happen is your numbers get bigger and bigger. Like the ratio of say, 8 to 5 approximates the golden section. 13 to 8 approximates it closer. 21 to 13 approximates it even closer. 34 to 21, 55 to 34, 89 to 55. As you go through and the numbers get bigger and bigger, what happens is you're asymptotically converging in on this golden section relation. You never actually get there. See, you oscillate above it a little, below it, above it, below it, above it, below it. And each time you oscillate, you're getting closer and closer and closer to it, but you only get there at infinity. When your numbers get infinitely large, then you're at that golden section. Now, what nature does is, of course, it approximates it, because we're all different, right? So you might take some people and their legs are longer, or their torso is longer, or their arms are long, and you measure them and they don't quite come up to the numerical value of the golden section, which in round numbers is 1.618033989 ... meaning it goes on forever, right? It's an irrational number like pi. For practical use, you would probably round it off at 1.6 and be close enough. Or if you needed to be really precise, go 1.618. Most people will remember that 1.618, and it's pretty easy to remember. But geometrically, by using the geometry of the pentagon or the double square and the square root of 5, which is inherent in the double square rectangle, you can create the golden section proportion with geometric exactitude, right? Or within the limits of your drawing capability. If you could draw with infinite precision, you could geometrically create that golden section. But mathematically or arithmetically, you can't. You can only approximate it to ever finer degrees of precision. So artistically, if you're going to use it, you obviously don't need it, out to 10 or 50 or 100 places. 2 or 3 places is going to be enough, see. But if you know the geometric technique, you can then set it up and you will create a rectangle where the long side is to the short side as 1.618 is to 1. And that gives you that rectangle. And then that was the basis, for example, we'll see a slide here shortly that says, that shows the facade of the Parthenon. And it fits perfectly into a golden rectangle. So typically in the days of building, in the old days, there would be a template laid out on the ground, right? The geometry would be drawn out on the ground. Then carpenters would come in. For example, like if you're going to do a Gothic cathedral with that ogival vault. Here you've got this amazing stonework that comes up and it'll come to a point, right? And then that's usually derived based upon the Vesica, which we will look at shortly. The Vesica being the feminine geometry. And you've got the vault like this. The stone was laid up over wooden formwork that was erected by the carpenters, right? Now the carpenter, the formwork obviously is not part of the finished structure. You would build this elegant formwork. The masons would come and lay up their stonework over it, and then once the stonework, the masonry work had set up, you would then remove the formwork of the wood. But when the formwork it would be laid out on the ground, and then once it was assembled, it would be raised like this. We still find that idea in symbolism, for example, in the raising of Osiris from death to life. In Freemasonry, there is in the 3rd degree the raising of the master builder who has been slain from level to perpendicular. And again, this recapitulates this idea. When the Egyptians would raise an obelisk, that was symbolizing the same thing, because the horizontal was considered to be emblematic of the non-living, and the vertical was considered to be an emblematic of the living. And the idea was that all of primitive life coming up through the hierarchy of ever more complex life, what we're seeing is the orientation from this now to the human being, the orientation of this. So it also symbolizes the journey of life, see? And now we as human beings are vertical. Our compass, the shaft of our compass here like this now, is our spine, you know, the seat of the chakras that we were just looking at. And our orientation is vertical from earth to heaven. And our compass, our tree of life, can be thought of as the vertical spine that links heaven to earth. And that was the idea of the temple. And the gnomon pole, or the obelisk, or whatever it was, the vertical shaft, that was the first mark that there was going to be a temple emerging from that site, you see. Yes, and here's the Parthenon. And I think we can see, if we go to one, we can see a rectangle. That's a golden rectangle coming in, showing the proportions. The width to height of the Parthenon is a virtually perfect golden rectangle. And then the yellow lines in there show the subdivision and how you harmonically subdivide the components of the whole composition to reflect the proportions of the whole. So, for example, you have a second golden rectangle there that defines the position of the column and the architrave up there. And then you have another golden rectangle up there and another one, you see. So you can subdivide this up into multiple degrees, and each one will manifest the original proportions of the whole composition, see. And this is the geometry of life. This is the geometry of the golden section that I was just talking about here, see. So it's a very elegant system.
What is Parthenon?
The Parthenon, that's the name of the structure. This was part of the Acropolis, and this was dedicated to Athena. And so there's actually there was originally a big statue of Athena inside the Parthenon. And so the Parthenon is a beautiful example of a temple that was laid out and built according to sacred geometry. The Greeks were obviously, you know, very into sacred geometry. We've got Plato, Pythagoras, and Euclid, you know, that they were obviously where we get most of geometry today is through the Greeks. And then later in the Middle Ages, you know, the Islamic world carried geometry up to the next level because, you know, the Quran forbids the artistic depiction of the human form. So in classical Islam, like in the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, when they were building these incredible mosques, they went into great depth to represent everything geometrically. And so they carried geometric patterns and proportionings and stuff to a very high level.
And can you tell us more about the symbol you mentioned, Vesica symbol?
Yes, of course I can. Here what we'll do is we'll look at how we get the Vesica. We've been talking about the hexagonal geometry, and you can see from here, each one of these sides is exactly equal to the radius of the original circle. So this is what makes the hexagon such a straightforward geometric figure to draw. You just draw the circle, pick any starting point, like here it could be the point labeled A, and then we just walk the compass around, and if we do that operation with accuracy, we'll go A, B, C, D, E, F, and then we'll come right back to the exact starting point. And then if we begin to connect the vertices of that hexagon as shown here, what we end up with is 6 equilateral triangles. And the equilateral triangles have the property that inherent within them is the square root of 3, which is an interesting number that we also find once we create this figure we mentioned earlier, the Vesica. So we're just showing here how you can create a number of rectangles out of the hexagon, and each of these rectangles will embody this proportion of the square root of 3 being the long side if the short side is 1. And that is the same ratio that we find within the Vesica that will be coming up here in a second. It'll go through showing how we create this succession of rectangles, and then when we lay the rectangles all on top of each other, we end up with the so-called Star of David, which is based upon the which is based upon the geometry of the hexagon. Now, if we go to the next slide, there you see the generation of the Vesica. It's basically two circles with the exact same size circle, and one of them is drawn, and then the second one is drawn, and you'll notice that the relationship here is that the center of each circle is on the circumference of the other. You see? So then what happens is you get this overlap in the middle. And that overlap is what's called the Vesica Piscis, or vessel of the fish. And early Christians could take that figure, turn it on its side, and add some details like an eye, a fin, or whatever, and they would get the image of Piscis, the fish, right? Now, the length to width ratio is that magic number, the square root of 3, which is part of this whole sequence of, we could call them magical numbers, or they're actually, in math, you would call them irrational numbers, because they can't be expressed as the ratio of two whole numbers. Just like pi, the relationship of the circumference of a circle to its diameter, cannot be expressed as the ratio of two whole numbers. You can put one of them as a whole number, but then the other one goes on endlessly without terminating and without repeating. So there's a family of these relationships that are actually derivative through very simple geometric operations like this one, but like the square root of 3, like pi, like the golden section, the square root of 2, the square root of 5, they are these endless numbers that go on forever. But right here we see the length to width ratio is the square root of 3. And so you get all the symbolism of the trinities and all of this that you find embedded in so many systems. And the Vesica is the symbol of the divine feminine. And the idea to the ancients was that it sort of represented an image of the womb. What's interesting about the Vesica is that the entire edifice of Euclidean geometry emerges from this fundamental situation here where you have two circles overlapping. We saw how if we connect the vertices here, we would get a equilateral triangle, which is 60 degrees, and then we get the crossing lines like this, which are 90 degrees. So from that one figure, we get both the 60-degree angle and the 90-degree angle. Through the combination of those two angles, we can generate a virtually infinite array of geometric form. And there you see how the Vesica relates to the hexagon and to that particular rectangle that I called the root 3 rectangle. Now this was one of the proportions that was used in sacred architecture, particular architecture that was dedicated to the feminine, to Mary, to the Virgin, to the goddess, all of those kinds of things. So if we go through this a little further, we can begin to see. This is the cover of the Chalice well at Glastonbury, England. The chalice in this case that it's referring to would of course be the Holy Grail, which again, a symbol of the feminine and the divine feminine. And there's some very interesting ideas surrounding the Holy Grail and what it actually was, if it was anything or if it was just purely symbolical. It's a long, complicated, the Grail is probably one of the most complicated symbols that we've inherited from olden times. And we could probably devote a whole interview just to talking about the Grail. But what's interesting here is that you're seeing the Vesica, the setup for the Vesica right here, where you've got two overlapping circles, and it's clearly showing this linkage between the symbolism of the Vesica and the symbolism of the Holy Grail. To some theorists, and I think there's merit to this, the Holy Grail was thought of as a sacred bloodline that came through Mary, and she was the progenitor of this particular bloodline that was then passed on to Jesus. And according to some researchers, and there's a pretty strong case for this, that Jesus actually had offspring that carried on this idea. But when you look at early Christianity, and there's so much symbolism in reference to the blood of Christ, and blood turning, like for example, at the crucifixion, one of the things that talks about is that Joseph of Arimathea used the chalice that was at the Last Supper that Christ drank from, right? When he said, "This is my blood," right? And he's drinking from the chalice. Joseph of Arimathea uses that chalice to collect the blood and water flowing from the side of Christ as he's hanging on the cross. And according to certain legends, he then sealed up the chalice, and with his followers, 12 followers, left and went to England, where he established the first, according to legends, and there may or may not be literal truth to it, but there are certainly legends and folklore around this. He went to England, established the first Christian church at which later became Glastonbury Abbey. There is a pretty well-known chapel that is part of Glastonbury Abbey dedicated to St. Mary. The proportions of that are based upon the Vesica, as we'll see here. And so Glastonbury Abbey is, through legend, it was considered to be a place where the Holy Grail was kept for a while. And we can go past this. Here we see what's called the Portal of Judgment that was at the facade, the western facade of Chartres Cathedral. And there you can see the Vesica. And you see Jesus is seated within the Vesica, which is an interesting juxtaposition of symbols. The Vesica was also referred to as it says up there, the mystic almond, right? And then the almond had rather interesting connotations to it. And then surrounding the figure are the four signs of, conventionally, the four evangelists, but esoterically the four signs, fixed signs of the zodiac, which, would be Taurus the bull, Leo the lion, Aquarius represented by the angel, and Scorpio represented by the eagle. And the reason for that is because the eagle and the Scorpio were considered counterparts. The Scorpio crawls on the ground, which represents the lower life, and the eagle obviously flies in the heavens, which represents the upper life. During the fall time, when Scorpio is rising, Aquila, the eagle, is rising with it. See, so it became a substitute for Scorpio. So you have the eagle there, again, representing a time within the wheel of the year, right? So you've got the four fixed signs, which, Leo would be summer, and Aquarius would be winter, and Scorpio would be fall, and Taurus would be spring. But it's also a symbol for the great year, which is the big year of 26,000 years. And within that big wheel, there were 4 points that were considered auspicious for some reason, and it was when the equinoctial line, which is slowly migrating through the signs of the zodiac, just like now for the last couple thousand years, this equinoctial line has been passing through the constellation, the star pattern of Pisces. And it's moving now out of Pisces, moving towards the constellation of Aquarius, right? So, astrologers and New Agers and stuff like to talk about going into the age of Aquarius, which in effect, astronomically, we will be over the next couple of thousand years as the vernal equinox is passing through that particular sign. Well, this is a doctrine that comes from way, way back. And it was enshrined actually in medieval Christianity. And there it is right there in the so-called Portal of Judgment. So this is in the tympanum that's above the door, the western doorway. So we have a symbol of geometry, which is space, but then it's surrounded by these 4 figures from the zodiac, which is a symbol of time. So we have this imagery here, which is a correlation of spatial imagery and temporal imagery. All right, so here we have the full image of the western facade in the entry. Over it is the tympanum with the imagery that we've just been talking about. Below it, we see the door. So the next slide will actually show the proportions of the Vesica define the door. So basically, as you're approaching the cathedral here, you're given a geometric forward, I guess, a geometric statement, a statement about the geometry upon which the whole edifice was based. So we see the geometry of the Vesica up there in the tympanum. We see it perfectly manifested as a root 3 rectangle in the door. And then when we go to the ground plan of the cathedral, we will see that the length to width ratio is the square root of 3. And I think the next slide will show enclosed within that root 3 rectangle and how that is used to determine the proportioning of the, the pillars, the nave, the transept, all of that. Here's the Vesica superimposed upon it. So you see that the overall ground plan is laid out according to the same geometry of the feminine. So on multiple levels, you see this geometry occurring. In the vault itself, most of the vaults will be like half of a vesica. Some of them are based upon the pentagon, or pentagram rather. Interestingly, in Chartres, the vault is based upon the pentagram, not the vesica, which obviously to me is telling us something. So it's integrating the root 3 geometry and the geometry of the golden section, which is based upon the root 5. So these guys were master geometricians, and they would bring in the symbolism of these geometric forms and figures to be an indication of what the function of this structure was, and then if we keep going here, we'll see here was St. Mary's Chapel at Glastonbury, England. So this was not built by Joseph of Arimathea, but the story is that they built a small church, round church initially. So this would have been the 1st century AD. The legend is that Joseph of Arimathea emigrated from the Holy Land, went to England, met up with Arviragus, who was one of the pagan chieftains, and Arviragus gave Joseph of Arimathea a big tract of land. It was actually, interestingly, 120 hides of land. And a hide was 120 acres, so you basically had 1,440 acres, which was the sacred precinct, the center of which they built this small round church, which was about 39.5 feet in diameter. And we know that because after a few hundred years, the small wooden church began to decay, and they replaced it, and they used lead to preserve the dimensions of the original, right? So it lasted up until, I think it was about the 1000s, and then an abbey was built, it burned down, and then they built the structure whose ruins are still there. St. Mary's Chapel was built, according to the legend, over the exact site that the original church was. The width of St. Mary's Chapel is about 39.5 feet. Actually, it's been measured, and it's at 39.6 feet wide, right? Here's the ground plan of St. Mary's Chapel. So it's 68.6 feet long, 39.6 feet wide. This ratio equals the square root of 3, meaning that the ground plan of the chapel is enclosed in a virtually perfect root 3 rectangle. It is also the case that its length to width ratio is that of the Vesica Piscis. And then I think the next slide will show, overlaying on it, in red is that root 3 rectangle, and in blue you see the 2 overlapped circles that give the length to width ratio. So again, if you understand the geometry, then you can see how it all correlates. That it's dedicated to the Christian version of the ancient goddess, right? And the geometry recapitulates that idea by being the geometry of the feminine. So again, there are numerous examples of this kind of thing, but this, I think, would give the listener sort of the general idea of how it worked. So here we have the root 3 rectangle that we've been talking about, which manifests the proportions of the vesica, length to width ratio. And inherent within this particular rectangle, like the family of rectangles, which I call dynamic rectangles, I didn't invent the term, but it was invented by J. Hambidge, an art historian who wrote a book in the early 20th century called Dynamic Symmetry, where he explored the properties of these unique rectangles based upon these irrational numbers like square root of 2, square root of 3, square root of 4, square root of 5, etc. But we're kind of focusing on the root 3 rectangle because that's the proportions of the vesica. Now, what you see here is that you have the diagonal of the rectangle, and then the second thing is that we erect, by a simple geometric operation, a perpendicular to that diagonal that goes up through the corner. As that particular line, perpendicular line, is projected to the base, it defines that point there, which is 1/3 of the root 3 rectangle. And we can see that we've generated 3 subdivisions of the original rectangle. Each of those smaller rectangles is a root 3 rectangle. See? So what we've done here is we've created a harmonic subdivision of the original. By within it, we've created 3 exact rectangles that if we took one of those, turned it on its side, enlarged it, it would be the one we started with. Okay, so we can see the sequence here. Here's the first perpendicular. Again, it's a perpendicular to the diagonal, and that perpendicular projected to the opposite side gives us the division where we recreate the original proportions. So we can go through this and we'll see that we're creating a sort of a dynamic pattern here of symmetry. And if you look carefully at this, you'll see that in all of these operations of sacred geometry, the idea is each step within the process gives you the points needed to create the next step. So each step that you take through the process of creating these diagrams, no matter how complex, relied on some previous step, which relied on a previous step, and ultimately goes back to something as simple as a point or a single line, right? So we can go through this, and what you see here now is I've highlighted four dots up there, and you'll see that those lines, those dots are formed by the vertical lines and the diagonal lines. Well, those dots give us the means of creating more lines, and what we've done now is just as we took the original rectangle, divided it into 3 duplicates of itself, now we've divided each of those 3 further into more so now we have 9 root 3 rectangles up here. Every one of them inherits the properties of the original. See? So this is what creates this system of harmony, is that there's this relationship between the part and the whole. And we can continue generating lines by entering diagonals, and what we end up with is ever finer degrees of proportioning here. So the idea again is that we can create ever greater levels of complexity by building upon points that are already inherent within the diagram. So if we follow this, you'll see that every introduction of additional lines will lead to the possibility of further degrees of subdivision. What we have here is that every one of those little rectangles is a root 3 rectangle, see? So now what you have is this, again, you have this harmony between the whole and the part. And this was a big part of what they were trying to achieve, was that when you went in to smaller parts and subdivisions within the pattern, that manifested or resonated with the whole. And then beyond that, the idea was to link the pattern into a greater pattern based upon the earth itself. We will go through, and I'm just showing how we can create ever more, and any one of those can be broken out, and then you can further subdivide it. So this was one of the typical templates that was also used by artists. And there are examples, and we might be able to show some of those, where the template underlies the painting, so that they would set out a template. And what you're looking for here is that when you are creating these, what you're looking for is these points of potency, like right there. Those 4 points are sort of like the action points within the figure. So if you create a composition and you somehow acknowledge the existence of those points, because it's those 4 points, you see, that now creates the next level, the next generation of the pattern, you see. You can't just randomly start putting points down and then recreate the original geometry. It has to be these points that are generated out of this sequence of lines and intersections. So we'll just go through, and you'll see that the root 3 geometry leads us to potential, just very simple, just showing some of the patterns and symmetries. The patterns within this literally are infinite. You know, whatever, they're limited only by your imagination. And you see all of these patterns here show the geometry of the root 3. And so then we get the hexagon. We're back to the hexagon, which is inherent within it. There's the hexagon and equilateral triangles. And when you superimpose those, you get the so-called Star of David, right? Which again manifests this particular geometry. And I think this was recognized by the geometricians in the ancient Judaic and Kabbalistic traditions, that there was this inherent geometry here, that there was these special properties to this particular geometric figure. And then out of that, we find that by utilizing those points, we then get the so-called flower of life, which again is based upon that 6-fold division of the circle and the hexagonal geometry, the root 3 geometry, all of that which is unified within that particular pattern of the flower of life, which of course is very simply drawn. You'll notice here that if you look at it, each petal of the flower, the point, is one of the points of the hexagon. So to get this, you simply draw one circle, you step the radius around the circle 6 times, then each of those becomes the center for drawing 6 subsequent circles, and what you end up with is that flower pattern. And so all of these properties that we're just talking about here are carried over into this figure of this particular flower, which is also, you know, the geometry of actual some real flowers in nature. I mentioned that the lily is based upon this pattern right here, and the lily was very significant in magical work and ritual work and symbolism and so on.
Why is the fractal nature of this geometry important?
Well, again, I think it's because what I've been kind of trying to reiterate here is that the fractal nature of it shows that there's this relationship. It's not just arbitrary. Like typically, if you build something just randomly, you build something and then you subdivide a room out of it, and there's no particular relationship between the room and the whole building. Or in the painting, you just choose, well, I'll put this here and I'll put that there. Mm-hmm. Maybe if you're really intuitive and really good, like some artists who I probably didn't know the system, nonetheless, their intuitive sense about it, they had that sense of proportion. So they knew that if they arrayed their composition in a certain way, that inherent within it, underlying the outer forms, were these geometric relationships between the part and the whole. And again, the idea is if the geometry is similar, if there's a self-similarity between the part and the whole, then there's a resonance between that. And now the composition becomes dynamic rather than static. And see, it's the static situation is basically like the non-living. And when you go from the static to the dynamic geometry, that's going from the non-living to the living. See, so the idea was to try to create a composition, whether it was a work of architecture, whether it was a woven rug, whether it was a stained glass window, whether it was a painting. The idea was that there was this dynamic relationship, this geometric proportion of harmony between the part and the whole. See?
Makes sense.
That's kind of what we have going on right there. And so there's the full kind of flower of life, and you can do all kinds of things with it. You know, if you go online and put this in, you'll see people who've done all kinds of wonderful things with colors and shadings and all of that. So, and then of course it gives one of the basic geometric proportions of the ancient architects.
Can you explain some of these shapes? Most commonly we see hexagons and pentagons in sacred geometry.
Yes, I can. If we look at this diagram right here, we're going to see the hexagon and the pentagon united by a single geometry. And you'll notice the unifying element of this, again, is the Vesica, which is, which I like to think of as the womb of sacred geometry. And here again, if we look at this particular feature, once we draw the two overlapping circles. And you'll see here that this line represents the radius, and then it's stepped around the third circle 6 times. You'll see that the third circle is centered on the vertex of the vesica. So 2 circles overlap, gives us the vesica. Then the vesica gives us both the vertical line and the horizontal line, right? And it gives us this particular point and that particular point there. We only need one of them for this particular exercise. So we now draw a circle, again with the same radius. And once we do that, we've created some additional points. You'll notice that there's the vertical axis of the vesica intersects the circumference of the circle right there. That gives us the points we need so that, I'll use this, so that now we can draw a line from this point of intersection up here through that point and project it on until it meets the circle there. We do the same thing, the symmetrical operation right here, and we get that point. Now we can use those 2 points, and in this operation we have not changed the setting of our compass. That's important. We've established the 2 circles, and in every subsequent step we have not altered this at all. So then we use that, we get here and here, and then that can give us the point of the pentagon up there. So now we have all the points we need to draw the pentagon, and we'll notice that they share a base, a common base. They have the same side length, right? Now, it turns out that this particular relationship is important in nature. And we'll go through a few things here to see this. So as it says here, in contemplating the symbolism of hexagon and pentagon, we note that flowers can display polygonal geometries in the configuration of their petals. Roses typically have their petals arrayed in whorls of 5. Several species of lilies have their petals arranged in whorls of 6, or 2 whorls of 3 petals each. So we have pentagonal geometry here in the rose, hexagonal geometry in the lily. And I'm going to just go through, we could talk about some of the symbolism, I guess, here. Roses were considered sacred to the goddess Isis. The Greeks' roses were associated with Aphrodite, who of course was Venus. Myth describes how a rose bush grew from a pool of blood spilled by Adonis, who was Aphrodite's lover. Medieval Christians associated the petals of the rose with the 5 wounds of Christ's passion. It was also viewed as a symbol of both blood and the Virgin Mary. The idea of the blood then gets us back to the Holy Grail, because the Holy Grail was the Sangreal, which could be interpreted as Holy Grail, but if you split it and it becomes Sangreal, or Sangreal was Holy Grail, Sangreal was Holy Blood. See, so right there in the structure of the words is kind of the hint of this underlying meaning. And this blood is again always associated with the Grail. In Persia, roses were given a prominent place in geometrical gardens, which again makes sense because they were looking at the geometry. To occultists and hermeticists, the rose was a symbol of secrecy, from whence comes the saying under the rose, or in the original Latin sub rosa, which perhaps originates with the Roman practice of hanging roses above the table around which a clandestine meeting was held, or at the door of the room in which the meeting took place. So we do have roses hung on the door here, right, while we're conducting this interview, so people know it's all top secret. In ancient Greece, candidates for initiation into the mysteries wore roses to indicate that they would keep inviolate the secrets entrusted to them. According to occultists, the rose vibrates at the highest frequency of any flower, and not infrequently those who have been witnesses to celestial visitations from the goddess have reported detecting the fragrance of roses. When united with the cross, the rose becomes a symbol of immortality and the transmutation of the human soul. So we'll go on here. Then the lilies are said by the Greeks to be created from the breast milk of Hera, goddess of marriage and childbirth, and therefore associated with motherhood. interesting. This is something that I think people could research on their own by going into the internet. There will be a lot of good information of this. But the idea is that the lilies, again, were hexagonal geometry. And then there was a symbol frequently found, or some connotation of it frequently found, excuse me, in alchemy. This was a recreation of a symbol in the book The Wonder Beyond by Mayananda. And he presents the image of the rose and the lily adjacent to each other in such a way that the positions of their petals reproduces Duré's drawing of the unification of hexagon and pentagon by means of the Vesica, which was the first image we looked at, which showed how the pentagon and the hexagon were united and how it was created with the Vesica. And then, of course, we have down here the alchemical saying igni natura innovatur integra, which means through fire nature is wholly renewed. And so we can go like this and back, and you'll see there's Duré's geometry of the united hexagon and hexagram. And then here, the magician, one of the tarot cards, is replete with roses and lilies, showing their sacred nature and their importance within magical practice. Because they believed in magical practice, as I mentioned earlier, that they had certain vibratory qualities that could be utilized during the magical working. We see the roses hanging above, just like, so here's the reference again to the idea of the sub rosa, see, because he's conducting his operation beneath the roses. Mm-hmm. So it's an occult operation, a secret operation. He holds his wand in hand, which is holding it up towards the heavens. The idea now it becomes a conduit, links the forces of heaven with the forces of earth. And then you have the four magical implements here, the sword, which represents air. You think of the sword slashing through the air. The pantacle, which represents the material world. It's usually typical, will be oftentimes a baked clay with a pentagram inscribed on it. The wand, which is fire, and if you look closely, you'll see that each tip looks like a flame coming out. And then, of course, the cup, which is, again, the Grail cup, which represents water and the waters of life, right? So all of this geometric symbolism can be used to help interpret and translate some of these other esoteric symbols or systems that we find in various traditions. Then we have the Fleur-De-Lis, which was oftentimes standing in for a threefold petal arrangement of the lily, see? Mm-hmm. And then the Fleur-De-Lis was linked with bees, and there's some deep symbolism there, which we'll save for another interview, because then we'll talk about the idea that the beehive, the bees in the beehive. So we kind of get this. What happens is it's almost dreamlike in the sense that how in dreams things kind of morph into each other. Mm-hmm. You'll be talking to a person in a dream, and then suddenly it's a different person, or you'll be at a place, and then it morphs into a different place. This symbolism working is kind of like that, because what you see is that symbols are dynamic. They can morph into other symbols. And see, that's what we see happening here with the idea of the Fleur-De-Lis, which comes from the imagery of the lily, right? It's derivative of the lily. In the Middle Ages, the symbols of lily and Fleur-De-Lis were confluent and could be associated with either Jesus or Mary. Both the lily and the Fleur-De-Lis were viewed as symbols of the Holy Trinity. And you'll know that in French, fleur means flower, and lis, L-I-S, means lily. So there it is right there. And then that symbol is linked to the symbolism of the bee, which takes us back to the importance of the bee symbolism in ancient cultures. And it had to do with a lot of things. For example, the bee's honeycomb is all based on hexagons. You see, so they build this structure, and if you're going to enclose a volume of space, and you want the most economical means of enclosing space, the bees have already figured it out. And like it says here, nature's choice of a hexagonal structure for the beehive is based upon the fact the hexagon is the most economical shape in terms of expenditure of energy and matter in its construction in proportion to its overall strength. A beehive can hold up to 40 times its own weight in stored honey. You see, and the fact that you have this at such an economical shape relates right back to the simplicity with which it can be drawn, you see, by these just simple steps. A circle, walk it off 6 times, and you've got it, you see. The strength to weight ratio of the beehive has critically important significance in understanding the meaning of the bee and beehives in the ancient occult language of symbolism, reaching from ancient Egypt through the Merovingian dynasty, the medieval alchemists and Sufi orders, and finally into modern Freemasonry. And here is a photograph. I think I took this, but in a lot of the temples, oh no, I didn't take this one because this is the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut, but in many of the temples you will find this depiction of bees. And then later, the Merovingian dynasty, which were the sacred kings of France prior to the Dark Ages, right? They were, and according to some theories, and there's a considerable amount of evidence that would kind of support this interpretation, that there was a bloodline descended from Jesus, and that somehow it found its way into the royal dynasty of the Merovingian kings. And they widely used the symbolism of the bee in the beehive to represent their claim to dynastic royalty. In Freemasonry, here's a Masonic apron from the 6th century, and note the beehive right there. As it says, this apron conceals an entire allegory encoded in symbolism representing cosmogenesis and the meaning of the great work. So, way beyond what we're going to be talking about today, but again, the symbolism of the bee, and then implicit within the beehive itself is this structural scheme based upon hexagonal geometry. And then this will be our link into the next thing we'll talk about in the adenine molecule, which is critical to the DNA. We find the pentagonal and hexagonal geometry being used by the atoms. In occult symbology, number 6 and its geometric counterpart, the hexagon, are representative of the world and the cosmic domain. The pentagon represents the domain of life in general, and more specifically the human domain. The association of the number 5 with humankind is overtly obvious with reference to the 5 senses, the 5 extremities, the 5 fingers, also the fact that our anatomy is based upon the golden ratio, which is derived from the Fivefold Geometry. It is less obvious, but no less a correlation between the number 5 and the domain of life that appears in the 5 chemical classes of the amino acids, the 5 nucleotide bases making up RNA and DNA molecules, the 5 carbon atoms in the deoxyribose sugar molecules, and that form the DNA helical spine, and the 10 stacked nucleotide base pairs in each coil of the DNA helix. The generation of the linked hexagon and pentagon through the medium of the vesica carries deep significance from the standpoint of geometry. Now, as you've seen, the hexagon is the simplest geometry. Pentagon, to create that, is more complicated. It requires extra steps. So actually here, the larger number, the 6-fold geometry, is really more primordial than the 5-fold. It's more primitive, see? So in a way, it's like if the 6-fold geometry is, as it says here in occult symbology, it represents the cosmic domain, that becomes the matrix out of which the 5-fold geometry emerges, just as we saw in the previous exercise. Mm-hmm. And the unification of that is the vesica, see, the symbol of the ultimate cosmic womb and the symbol of the divine feminine. So as it says here, we see that the hexagon is the simpler of the 2 forms and occupies a preliminary position in the drawing exercise of linking hexagon and pentagon through the medium of the vesica, necessarily appearing prior to the emergence of the pentagon, even as the cosmos had to exist before humankind could emerge out of the confluence of material and energy resources generated through the evolution of the universe. The hexagon, which is the world or cosmos, appears through a much simpler geometric process than the pentagon, symbolizing life and humanity. The molecular architecture of biology utilizes the geometry of pentagons and hexagons and their interface in some very important ways. So here we're looking at a representation of a deoxyribose sugar molecule, which forms itself according to the geometry of the pentagon. This is an integral part of the much more complex DNA molecule. The red represents carbon atoms, the blue represents oxygen atoms, and we see that this particular molecule, the deoxyribose sugar molecule, is linked covalently to an oxygen atom right here that's actually part of a phosphate cross. So we'll see how this geometry works here. Here's the deoxyribose 5-carbon sugar molecule, and here is the phosphate cross, which is based on the fourfold geometry. It's through a hydrogen bond. The little gray ones represent hydrogen atoms, and that's what links the phosphate molecule to the sugar molecule. And this forms part of the structure of the DNA. Here you can see that the sugar molecule links to a phosphate, fourfold phosphate molecule on one end, and then on the other end. So that creates the beginning of a chain called a phosphodiester bridge or bond, right? And then we can see, we'll go here, and then you have the organic nitrogenous bases, such as the pyrimidines and the thymine. There's a thymine molecule on top, the cytosine molecule on the bottom, and they're based on the sixfold geometry. So now we have the phosphate molecule, which is a fourfold geometry. We have the deoxyribose sugar molecule, which is fivefold, and now we have the nitrogenous bases, which are sixfold. And so these geometries come together so that, for example, here we have linking the hexagonal and pentagonal architecture of the purine bases, adenine and guanine. These bases pair with the pyrimidine bases, thymine and cytosine. So here we have the sugar molecule linking to the nitrogenous bases. And then we can see they start linking together. These geometric forms begin linking together in these chains. So they create these chains of geometries that are formed through, let's get to this one, let's see, here we go. So we can see we have all of these linked together by the fourfold geometry, fivefold geometry, and sixfold geometry. And we see in here that hexagon and pentagon united, which seems so critical in a lot of molecular bonding that goes on. And here we see the formation of these chains. We have these covalent bonds linking these things together, which are very hard to break, and we have hydrogen bonds which are easy to break because it's nature's supreme plan for replicating life, because the DNA helix is 2 strands linked by these weak hydrogen bonds, which allows them to break apart. But the integral part of each chain is a much stronger covalent bond. So now you have the helical DNA molecule that splits apart when it gets subjected to stresses, splits apart, and now it's a free floating chain within probably a matrix of fluid, which is now replete with the other elements, the building blocks. So they begin to attach themselves to the free-floating chain, and they build a whole new DNA molecule. So this is sort of the geometry of the DNA flattened out, but when we take it, we form it into this helical thing, we get that particular structure. And interestingly, the increments in that of the chain, the turns, are defined by the geometry of the golden section. So it's really quite remarkable that you find this geometry. Obviously the people building cathedrals and temples hundreds or thousands of years ago presumably didn't know any of this, and yet they were duplicating the same geometry, the geometry that we see right here in the fundamental process of life itself. We see that hexagonal, pentagonal linkage in the molecules that are delivered to Earth in meteorites. As it says here, studies of meteorites that have fallen to Earth have revealed that they contain the building blocks of DNA in the form of the purine nucleobases, which, as we have seen, organize themselves according to the union of pentagonal and hexagonal rings. Their presence in meteorites provides powerful confirmation of the hypothesis that life originated in space and was subsequently delivered to Earth through the agency of comets and their meteorite offspring. It demonstrates that life is cosmic in origin and confirms that geometry is fundamental to the generation, function, and propagation of life throughout the universe. And I kind of like this particular image right here because it links the 5 and the 6, showing that it's this process of the 5 and the 6 that brings about the fundamental processes of life, and then ultimately, I think, leads up to the generation of mankind, humankind. And in another section, we'll talk about that in more detail, and the squaring of the circle exercise, which is sort of like the ultimate exercise in sacred geometry, because the circle and the square symbolize generally irreconcilable forces within nature. We think about the square, it's very rational, it's very measurable. It's finite. You can look, if you know the side length, you automatically know the perimeter by a simple multiplication of 4. Circle, on the other hand, it's irrational. You cannot express both the circumference and the diameter as whole numbers. Pick a whole number for one of them, then the other number is just this non-terminating, non-repeating number that goes on forever and ever and ever that we call pi, right? So to the ancients, the circle was the representation of the infinite, right? There's no starting or stopping point, really, right? The square was the symbol of the finite. The circle was the symbol of the irrational element, the square, the rational. The square was the symbol of the material domain, the circle of the spiritual domain. The square of earth, the circle, heaven, right? Now, in geometry, there is no way of using just the tools of geometry, which is the compass and the unmarked straight edge, as that was the rule laid down in the Euclidean schools and the Platonic Academy. So there's no way to generate or create a circle and square of exact equal perimeter. There are, however, several methods of approximating it very, very close, so that visually you couldn't tell the difference, right? So the idea was the squaring of the circle was the attempt to create a circle in one pattern with the use of the compass and straight edge only to create a square and a circle of equal perimeter, or as close as you could possibly get, right? It could also mean finding a circle and a square of equal area. Both of them contained the same symbolical connotation, which was the unification of irreconcilables. The unifying of the infinite with the finite, of the rational with the irrational, of the material with the spiritual. And in Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, he's kind of hidden in there the squaring of the circle, because he's got a circle and a square of virtually equal perimeter. And we find that in the basis of many of the sacred structures of old.
Is there a connection between sacred geometry and consciousness?
Oh, well, I think geometry is inherent to totally. I would think that there is, yes, because even like we saw with the meditating man figure with the chakras. Then we saw that each of those chakras have geometric properties. So sound has geometric properties. Color has geometric properties. There are many meditation systems that use sound, mantras, and so on. And what you'll find is, in some of them, if you actually look at the set of mala beads, the meditation beads, there'll be 108 beads. See, so you do a repetition of the mantra, you roll the bead through your hand, so you don't count consciously, you roll the bead through, you do a mantra repetition, you roll the bead, and there's a starting bead that's bigger or somehow different than the rest, right? So you start there, you repeat your mantra, roll the bead, and by the time you've done 108 repetitions, you see, now you've done, that's the idea, you've completed a cycle. If you do 2 repetitions, you've done 216. If you do 4, you've done 432. These are foundational numbers of the whole system of translating geometric form into numbers. Now, when we look at the pentagon right here, for example, you can see that if you've got a right angle, that's 90 degrees, right? In a pentagon, it's greater than 90 degrees between each adjacent side, right? The angle there is 108 degrees. So that 108 degrees corresponds to the 108 beads on a set of meditation beads. So right there, you're linking, the idea is you're linking in a sort of a series of harmonic relationships. You're controlling your breath, your heartbeat. So your heartbeat beats a certain number of times per minute. You breathe a certain number of times per minute. And the idea is that you're linking yourself through these numbers, these numerical relationships that are directly derived from geometric form. You're linking yourself with the rhythms of the cosmos. That's the idea there. And so, for example, I do a meditation, I have a mantra which is 6 syllables, right? So if I go through the entire sequence of 108, I do 6 repetitions. I've done 648 repetitions, or 648 syllables. See, right? I've done I've done 648. Yes, if I go through one cycle of 108, sorry, and each repetition is 6 syllables, then 648 syllables I've repeated through one cycle. And 648, again, is one of the fundamental building block numbers. Think back to the Vesica with the 4 symbols of the ages, the bull, the lion, the eagle, and the man. The full wheel of the precessional cycle in the archaic models of the great year was 25,920 years. And this is based upon this precessional motion of the Earth's axis, which is doing this. You can think of it as the third motion. And as it does this, it's bringing the Earth into a constantly, slowly changing relationship between the Earth and the cosmos, right? So roughly 13,000 years ago, right now the North Pole of the Earth points to the Polaris, the North Star. If we go back 13,000 years ago, it was pointing over towards the star Vega, and Vega was the pole star. So that was like a different epoch altogether, see? Just as in the annual year, you have 12 months and 4 seasons. In the great year, there are 12 months and 4 seasons. The months of the great year are the 1/12 of the time that the vernal equinox spends in each of the signs of the zodiac in succession, just like we were talking about earlier, talking about the age of Pisces going into the age of Aquarius, and so on, right? If we go back halfway through the cycle, the vernal equinox was on the cusp of Virgo Leo. So about 13,000 years ago, the axis of the Earth was passing as a great pointer, passing from the constellation of Virgo into the constellation of Leo, right? That was one of the great times of dynamic change in Earth history. And the old order of things was completely replaced, even to the point where scientists like geologists and paleontologists and things are looking at that and realizing that this was a time of profound change, right? Well, what I'm getting at here is that, going back to that number 648 that I mentioned, if you look at each of the months of the 4 of the great year, they reach 2,160 years long. So 12 times 2,160 is 25,920. Each season of the great year was composed of 3 months. Each month, 2,160 years. So if you multiply the 2,160 by 3, you get 6,480. So picture, again, the Vesica with the 4 creatures. That's symbolizing each of those as a season of the great year, which lasts 6,480 years. So you can see that same number, that's the number of repetitions that I was talking about. See, so when you meditate, you're synchronizing your consciousness with these larger rhythms. Mm-hmm. You're synchronizing your breathing, your heart rate, all of these things with these higher temporal patterns, the rhythms of the cosmos. That's the idea. And the idea also, as above, so below. Keith Critchlow used to say, as without, so within. And the idea that our consciousness and the outer world are reflections of each other. See? So those patterns that define harmony in the outer world are the patterns that define harmony of our consciousness. And I think this was at the basis of the various systems of yoga and meditation, was by doing the breathing, doing the mantra repetition. You brought your own consciousness into a rhythmical resonance with the larger rhythm of the cosmos.
And is that the reason some of these geometric patterns, they invoke an emotional state?
Yes, yes. In fact, the medieval Muslims were highly proficient in this, knowing how to build mosques and structures where the geometry, the form itself, could induce emotional states. I experienced that very strongly when I went into the chapel at Lourdes. As soon as you walk into the structure, you immediately get overwhelmed with emotion. And I wasn't even expecting it when I was there. And, I went up into the chapel, and as I was in there, I began observing other people, like tourists and stuff, would come walking in, and within a matter of 30 seconds, they're crying. And there was some quality of the space. And I would love to, go back there and actually do a geometric analysis of the space. But clearly, something was going on there. And I think it was more than just the fact that they had effigies and stuff there. And, a lot of the people there, this is at Lourdes, where Bernadette had this vision of the Queen of Heaven, right? And I don't know if you know the story or not, but there's a very interesting geological component to it, because one of the things that the Queen of Heaven, when Bernadette Subaru asked the woman in white what her name was, who she was, she said she referred to herself as the Queen of Heaven, which is interesting because in the Egyptian traditions, Isis is always referred to as the Queen of Heaven, right? Anyways, so she gets this whole following of people who trust and believe in her, and that her visions are authentic and credible. And then you've got the other side that's saying, no, she's a charlatan and this is all made up. It's, she's a fraud and all of this. And so there was this whole conflict that arose. But at one point, the local bishop wanted her to ask the Queen of Heaven to perform a miracle. So he wanted a certain rose bush to bloom out of season, right? Instead of that, she told Bernadette to dig in the ground at this place and to root up the plants and to actually eat the dirt. So she was down on her hands and knees, like digging there, and below this cliff face, right, in front of this grotto. And everybody concluded she's crazy. This confirmed the skeptics that said she was crazy, right? So everybody leaves, and then it turns out that right where she was digging, this huge, copious spring just comes forth. And has just been flowing copiously since then. Mm-hmm. So, I went there, and you see people lined up for hundreds of yards waiting to drink or to bathe in the water of this spring. And up on the cliffside, you see dozens and dozens of crutches hanging there, which were left there by people who came in on crutches and walked out on 2 feet. So there's something very special going on there. That water is imbued with some kind of unique property, right? Now, in the cliff over the grotto, where there is now an effigy of the heavenly queen, presumed by Catholics to be the Virgin Mary, but really consistent with a lot of these kind of celestial visitations through history. They have built a chapel. And when you go up and you go into that chapel, that's when you get this experience of this intense emotional feeling, which I attribute to somehow to the energy quality of the site. And probably the energy quality of the site is then being amplified by the geometry and the materials of the chapel itself.
And some of this symbolism is connected to some of the conspiracy stories out there regarding Illuminati. How do you feel about all of that?
Well, I tend to be skeptical of a lot of conspiracy theories. We're kind of getting into some, kind of strange territory there. You could say in effect that the universe itself is some kind of a conspiracy. But to me, there was historical Illuminati that was founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, existed for a few years, and it was actually disbanded. And I have not seen, other than constant references to the Illuminati. My question is, well, who are they? I mean, I haven't seen anything other than, I've never seen a scholarly examination of, well, is there this secret society called the Illuminati that even exists? Because it would be hard, in my opinion, to pull that many strings in society and still be, completely hidden away. I'd like to see the hard evidence on that. Now, I would say, though, that in my opinion, there have been secret societies throughout the ages. For one thing, there were many times in history where certain beliefs and certain organizations were not permitted. Like, for example, when Hitler took over Germany, one of the first things he did was shut down Masonic lodges and outlaw them. When Stalin took over Russia, when he outlawed Masonic lodges. If you go back to the Middle Ages, there were, you had a very defined set of beliefs that you were allowed to endorse. And if you went beyond that, you were a heretic. So there have been heretical groups throughout history, the Gnostics and the Martionists and others, whose existence had to be secret because if they were found out by the ecclesiastical authorities, they were declared to be heretics, and they were often, burned at the stake or flayed alive or whatever. So there certainly has been the necessity of secrecy through history. These days, my impression is that as society has advanced and as we have, post-Renaissance and the scientific and the Enlightenment and so on, once human beings got the freedom to think and speak freely, and once we had the idea of the freedom to speak enshrined in our Constitution, there wasn't the need for secrecy anymore, in the same sense. If we go back to the Middle Ages, I think we find the last great manifestation of what I would say is a secret plan to undertake this enterprise, this building enterprise. From about 1130 to the early 1300s was the peak of this Gothic building boom in Europe. It came during the medieval warm period. We talked about this the other day a little bit. There were some very hard times between the 500s and the 900s. This is generally what's come to be called the Dark Ages. And we know now that large parts of the Earth's surface were quite malignant. There was periods of darkness. There was periods of dust saturation of the atmosphere, both from large volcanic eruptions, but also probably from a series of impacts from objects from space that kind of kept the environment inhospitable for 300 to 400 years. The Dark Ages was a time of cold. It was a time where the forward momentum of civilization was stymied by conditions. Between 900 and 1000 AD, what you had was the Dark Ages passed, and you had a period of global warmth, and often that's called the medieval warming period, which interestingly has been changed to the medieval anomaly because of the fact that it seems that you don't want to acknowledge that there was a period of warmth, at least as warm as it is now, and it was actually a very beneficial time for human society, because for one thing, the growing season increased by weeks, maybe even a month or month and a half over what it had been. There were far fewer crop failures. There was more rainfall during this warm period. So what happened was you had a series of crop surpluses. When you have crop surpluses, people can eat and they get healthy and strong. And what then happens is they now create a surplus. They become wealthy because agriculture is the basis of all wealth. And then the warm period came on in about 1000 AD. After a century and a half of that, Europe had accumulated enough wealth that they could undertake this amazing enterprise of building these Gothic cathedrals. What's interesting is the Gothic cathedrals, while they were being built, you had the last phase of the great monumental earthwork architecture in North America. You had the last phase of the classical Mayan architecture in Central America and the Yucatan. And you had the final phase of the great temple building in Indochina and in areas of Cambodia, Thailand, and Vietnam, which led to the construction of things like Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom. So it's very interesting that it seems over a very short period of time, you have simultaneously these waves of building going on around the world by different groups. But it was largely made possible by the fact that we had a couple of hundred years of very benign warm climate. In the early 1300s, several things happened. One thing, there was a couple of big volcanic eruptions, right? Climate began to cool. There were agricultural collapses. Crops died in the field. There were starvation, famine. When famine happens, people get weak. Their immune systems become compromised. When that happens, opportunistic diseases can spread. And so rapidly, in the wake of this global cooling, you had famine, and then that was followed by the bubonic plague, which wiped out a third of the population of Europe, and basically there went the labor force that was doing all of this incredible work. And it was in other parts of the world too. We see that the Anasazi culture in the southwestern deserts of America collapsed at about the same time, because when the global climate cools, there's less evaporation, less moisture in the atmosphere. So now there was a drought in the Southwest. There was a drought in Central America that caused the collapse of the Mayan culture. So these things are all integrated. And what happened then in the wake of this was a lot of the knowledge went underground. The knowledge that the medieval Freemasons were incorporating into their big cathedrals. Freemasonry went from being operative to speculative, which means from operative to philosophical. Because during the times of the building enterprise, you became a Mason, and all Masons were operative Masons, meaning that they used the trowels, they were stone cutters, they were glaziers, they were carpenters, but they were actively engaged operationally in the building enterprise. Once the building enterprise collapsed, in order to preserve the secrets, Freemasonry went from being operative to speculative, which means from operative to more philosophical. The purpose of that, the stratagem there, was to preserve the knowledge that they were the custodians of. And they had inherited. You can actually almost trace back to even the times of the building of King Solomon's temple, roughly 1000 AD, and how that knowledge, it seems like this corpus of esoteric knowledge and wisdom that actually had practical applications was passed down through various groups, such as the Comachines, the
the Dionysian artificers who kind of bridged the span from Solomon's temple's time, which was 1000 BC, down to the beginning of the modern era. You then had the Roman Collegium that seems to have inherited their body of knowledge and information. Then when Rome collapsed and the Dark Ages came on, you had the Comachines, they were called, which was a group that lived on an island in the Lake Como in Italy. And they seem to have been dedicated to preserving this knowledge and information, and became the link between the classical world and the medieval world. And in the medieval world, like I said, after the passing of the Dark Ages and this new period of global warmth, we see the knowledge sort of coming out of the cloistered, out of the monasteries and the cloisters, and now becoming operational. And that's what we see during the Middle Ages all over the world. We see, like in 5 different places, we see suddenly people are building these structures that within them have the same, they don't necessarily look the same, but underlying is the same geometric template, the same system of orientation, the same system of astronomy and so on, right? Which brings up a very interesting question. Were these just independent developments, or was there some link, that where someone had this body of knowledge and said, if you use geometry in this way, and you understand astronomy in this way, and you understand geology in this way, you can synthesize all this into this system. Anyways, the medieval warm period came to an end. The world got cold again and dark for a while. And crops failed in the fields. It got cold, it got damp, and you had starvation. This was what brought an end to this amazing period of the High Middle Ages. And then civilization struggled for a while. Took a break, sort of in the middle, what we call the Little Ice Age was 2 phases. Sort of took a break in the middle, which was the Renaissance. And the perpetuation of knowledge and science and learning that took place in the Renaissance was enough to propel civilization, to propel society over the second phase of the Little Ice Age, which basically came to an end between 1800 and about 1850. And we began to go into a warming phase at that point. This is one of my criticisms of some of the claims about global warming now, because global warming now is being blamed exclusively on the amount of anthropogenic carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, right? Which has only been significant enough to have to create a climate signal since roughly World War II. Prior to that, human carbon dioxide contribution to the atmosphere was very small. But we see the present day warming as a continuation of warming that actually began in the 1800s, about a century at least before significant human carbon dioxide enhancement, which to me right there is it should raise a question mark about how much then of the warming subsequent to, say, World War II is actually human caused and how much is natural. And that could be the topic of a whole discussion. But what we've seen in history is that times of warmth have always been much better than times of cold, because the times of cold are what brings about agricultural collapses, crops dying in the field, and people going hungry. Times of warmth have always been times of population expansion, life expansion, the increase in just physical stature of people, the reduction of infant mortality, all because of the fact that there's basically more nutritious food. So that's a whole issue. My take is that basically the mysteries have been slowly getting lost. And as we come to the 20th century, I think sort of the wisdom of the ancient mystery tradition reaches its nadir. And then once it reaches its nadir, I think throughout the 20th century, we see a revival. We see a kind of a convergence of East and West that takes place in the late 1800s, early 1900s. We see the rise of theosophical ideas. We see, yogis and swamis and things coming from India and bringing knowledge. Swami Vivekananda came and had a big influence on a lot of people in the Western world. There was Gurdjieff and Sri Aurobindo. There was a lot of these teachers who in the early 20th century began what I think of as a revival of this ancient spiritual knowledge. And so throughout the 20th century, you kind of see many of these ideas coming back again. It really accelerated during the late 60s and 70s, particularly in American culture. You see a big return to spiritual ideas, people looking, to Eastern spirituality. You see, the revival of yoga and meditation and other spiritual disciplines, very much accelerating during the 60s and continuing, through the 80s, 90s, and into the 21st century. What's interesting now, I think, is that we're in a position where we can really scientifically see and verify that there was this rational basis to a lot of these ancient systems of occult, which simply means hidden. And so a lot of this is now coming back out again. People are learning and putting these pieces together. And I hope and think that we're on the threshold of a revival where we will begin to say, you know what, a lot of these archaic principles of sacred geometry and the way they created their environments, the way they were attempting to create their civilization, actually has scientific merit. There is a basis of value to the idea of harmony, to reciprocity, to resonance, and that we can actually create a better world by incorporating those principles, reviving those principles, and actually establishing them on a very solid scientific foundation. It begins by creating prototypes, creating small prototypes that show, here we can create a model of what's possible. And then other people can learn from that. Just like the first Gothic cathedral was St. Denis Abbey, which was started in 1830. And that became the model. People saw that and they went, wow, there's something going on here. And that inspired enough people that, that the resources became available to build 80 other great monuments. And I imagine that the phenomena was parallel in these other places where this amazing building activity was going on. See, and people could see and feel for themselves the harmony, the beauty, the quality of energy that manifested in these structures, which were basically amplifying what was already there, but integrating it in a certain way, using the geometry and the special siting and so on. So, I would really like to, optimistically, I like to think that, we're on the verge of a major rediscovery and reapplication of these sacred principles. And this time, and I don't see that there has to be any conflict between that and scientific confirmation that there is something that happens when you use certain shapes, certain forms, certain patterns, certain proportions, materials in a certain way. That was what the alchemists were all about, was the material, the prima materia, and taking that prima materia through this 12-step process that raised its vibrational frequency. So now it resonates on a level that can directly affect life in a very beneficial way. That was kind of the idea.
That's good to know.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your insights on this.
Thank you for having me so much. I've enjoyed this immensely.